In this video, we will add Redux to our application. Previously, we initialized our project using Create React App, added Redux style components and our other modules, set up our folder structure, we added some base styling, and then we started our project in dev mode to the simple starter application. To add Redux, we'll go into our store folder. Inside here, we will add our index.js, which will hold our store configuration. We'll add middleware.js, which will initialize our middleware. We'll add reducer, which will hold our root reducer. And we'll also create a folder so that we can have a reducer and some actions to work with. And we'll call this one app. So first, inside the index folder, we'll create a configure store function. So we import create store from Redux, which will be used to initialize the store. We'll import reducer from our root reducer, and we'll import middleware from our middleware configuration file. And then our configure store function will take in initial state as an argument. It will create the store using create store, which takes the reducer as the first argument, the initial state as the second argument, and then the middleware as the third argument. Let me fix that function declaration. And then we return the store. And this will be the default export from this file. And the reason we passed in initial state into the function as opposed to importing it somewhere is because the initial state can be pretty tricky sometimes because it can come from many places. It can be sent from the server. It can be initialized state from server-side rendering. You can load things from local storage. So if we pass it in as a function, it allows us to do that initialization before we get to this create store and initialize it however we need to. Now we'll create our root reducer. So we'll assume that we have an app reducer already built, which we'll build in a second. And we'll also use combine reducers from the Redux package. Import the app reducer that we'll build soon. And then initialize our root reducer. And currently we have one reducer in there, which is the app. And what combine reducers does is it will take all these separate objects from the Redux store and combine them into one larger object with the name as the key. And then we can export that as our root reducer. Now we will initialize the middleware. First, we will import apply middleware and compose from Redux. And these are helper functions to build the middleware chain out, which is just an array. We'll import thunk from Redux thunk, which is a middleware that will allow us to manage side effects. And we'll import create logger, which is a logger utility for the Chrome console that allows us to inspect our store at any point in the app's lifecycle. We'll create an isProd variable to be used, where we'll just say if process.env.nodeenv is production, which is something create React app will automatically build for us or set to the nodeenv variable. And then we'll initialize our middleware list, which is just an array. So we will always need thunk, so we'll go ahead and middleware list push thunk. And then if it's not production, we'll push the create logger middleware as well, and it's a function, so you will call it inside here. Middleware. And then finally we'll say const middleware equals compose, apply middleware list. So I won't go too deep into what's happening here, but if this is foreign to you or this looks a little unfamiliar or difficult, I encourage you to watch Dan Abramov's video on Egghead. It's excellent. He goes through the entire Redux library, what middleware is, and really makes it very step-by-step easy to understand what's happening. And finally, we will export the middleware. Now we go to our app, and every reducer will have actions and a reducer file. So we'll create reducer.js and actions.js. And if you notice, we used app instead of having an actions folder and a reducer folder. I've found that when you have a huge reducers building up, you'll have these very long actions folders, you'll have these very long reducer folders, and it makes it very difficult to kind of find the files that you need, keep them together. So I found that I was always having the same named files within each actions and reducers and using them together. So one thing that's becoming more popular is grouping by feature as opposed to functionality. In this case, this will be the app feature. We'll also have one for stories. So then you keep the functionality together. So it's really easy to use your actions, use them with reducers. You know where to import them, and you don't have to do as much digging through your code base to find files that are associated with each other. So inside our actions, we will create a namespace for this action, and we'll call it @hnclone. And then it's for the app feature. Export const action types. And an action type is just a constant string, so it allows you to indicate the action being called. And we'll call this one set theme, since we have a dark and a night mode theme. And then we prepend it with the namespace. And then we have our actions, which is just a function that will return a pure object, plain old JavaScript object. And we'll call it set theme. It will take a payload, and we'll default that to an object, and it returns the action type of set theme and a key name payload with the object as the value. We export default actions. Now we can initialize our app reducer. First, we'll import the action types. From actions. We'll create an initial state for our reducer. And we'll set the theme to dark. We'll create the app reducer itself, which is just a pure function that returns an object, which is the updated value of the state. And we'll initialize our state to the response of the get initial state call. And then the action itself, which will have a type and a payload. And then it's a function, and we'll use the switch statement, which takes type as an argument. And we'll have the case of our action matching action types, which is set theme, which will return an object, and we spread the state to get the old values of the new state, but it will also create a new object itself, and we'll spread the payload, and the payload will probably take the form of theme value, So it will just replace the value of the theme in our state object. And then we have a default case where we just return the current state. And that is our baseline app reducer. All right. And now we can attach the state to our application. So this is done using the React Redux bindings. So we go to index.js in our source folder, which is at the root. We will import provider from React Redux. And then we will actually just create a render app function because you might need to handle functionality outside of it. So this is just an additional way for the future if you need to pass values to the render app or make sure something's initialized before calling render. And we'll say, oh, we also need to import our configure store function. So import configure store from store. Right now, we'll just assume our initial state is an empty object, so we'll get the defaults that we created in the stores. And const store equals configure store initial state. Then I like to store.dispatch and then initiation, so we know that our reducer will have been built. At Hacker News clone init. And then finally, we call the React DOM render function, but instead of just passing it the app, it will actually be using the provider component from Redux. Store is equal to our store. And we add the app inside of it. Configure store there. And then make sure we execute render app. Combine reducers is not defined. Let's double check that. Combine typo. Looks like our app's built. We see a refresh. We get our UI. That's good. We check our console and we have Redux. So now, as you can see, we have the Redux store added to our application. The next step is to just commit that. And you're done.